Hello, students. This week we move into the 1940s and bebop jazz, which is really the defining line of where modern jazz begins. Now, what's important to understand about this music is what was happening in America uh, in the 1940s, what bebop, where it came out of. And in the 1940s, America was dealing with World War II, and a lot of various things were happening. I got some uh, various PowerPoint pictures up there. Women entered the workforce. One of the reasons women entered the workforce because so many men were being drafted and going off to World War II. And you had some crazy things going like rationing, and people were making their own gardens in the backyard because all our stuff had to go overseas to the soldiers fighting the war in Europe. Now, because of the war, the big bands, the swing bands, started to decline. Now, a few reasons that they declined was World War II came in, and a lot of men got drafted, and these bands broke up. The record industry, because of rationing, couldn't use the materials to make records anymore, so the record industry suffered. The AFM was an American Federation of Musicians. They wanted all musicians to get paid every time a song got played on the radio, so there was a dispute. So what ended up happening is radios said, well, we aren't going to play any more of this big band music. We're going to put on some other kind of music that we don't have to worry about this. And a lot of music they started to put on was music that featured vocalists, because vocalists were not considered musicians at the time. So a lot of vocalists started to go into the radio airwaves, and as a result of just popular taste changing anyway, more emphasis started to be placed on vocalists. And ever since the 1940s, popular music has been about vocalists. As you move through the 40s, 50s, 60s, popular music is not instrumental music. Popular music is the vocalists, and it all begins in the 1940s as vocalists take center stage. Now, where does bebop come from? Well, what happens is these musicians who've been playing in the swing bands are just getting really bored playing the same commercialized swing arrangements over and over. They're very talented musicians, so they begin to experiment with standard swing tunes. They just try and make them more complicated, more technical, more virtuosic. So when the swing bands declined, it kind of left a space for jazz musicians to kind of move in and try different things. Also, because there are no more big bands, jazz groups became smaller, 4, 5, 6 pieces. Okay. Also, in the 1940s, a cabaret tax was instituted, all part of the war effort. Clubs were losing money; they had to make more money. So clubs would get taxed if they had a dance band in there. Clubs didn't want to be taxed, so they said we won't have any kind of dance music. So if we put some small groups in there that are playing non-dance music, nobody's going to dance, and we won't get taxed on the cabaret. So these were very conducive to these small groups forming. Now, bebop has very specific characteristics. First of all, the melodies become much more complex. They took the standard swing chords of tunes that everybody knew, had been playing for a couple of decades, and they just put new, complicated melodies over them. The harmonies became really, really advanced, and often they used chord substitutions, meaning they started using chords that people didn't expect, that they weren't used to. The tempos of bebop are much faster, and the whole idea of bebop was the emphasis on virtuosity, the sheer musical genius of people playing this music, and emphasis on surprise. Your ears never knew what was coming next. The biggest architect of this new music was the alto saxophone player Charlie Parker. Musical genius. He was a virtuoso alto saxophonist, and he, along with Dizzy Gillespie, they're the two that created this new language of modern jazz. Definitely modern. And the thing about the modern jazz is it started to lose more listeners because you had to be really discriminating to start listening to this new kind of music. Your ear really had to kind of follow the language that was now being spoken. And Charlie Parker was such an incredible genius virtuoso. he raised the musicianship level for any musician that on any instrument that came after him. The other partner of his that helped create this new modern language was the great trumpet player Dizzy Gillespie. He was a virtuoso. He was his generation's Louis Armstrong. And along with Charlie Parker, they created the language of bebop and modern jazz. In addition, Dizzy Gillespie kind of became the face of bebop. He was out there much more in the public and media than Charlie Parker was. And what he did is he modernized the big band. He formed a big band and showed that a big band does not have to be a swing band. It could play this new modern language, this new bebop language. And Dizzy was very fascinated by other kinds of music and other cultures, and he introduced Afro-Cuban rhythms into jazz. You will also be introduced to Thelonious Monk, and Thelonious was a bebop pianist, but he had a very percussive style, so he didn't play in these super long, fast, complicated lines that a lot of other beboppers are doing. But he really brought into it some very interesting rhythmic ideas, melodic ideas, and he was a very percussive type of player. And most importantly, he was a composer, one of the great jazz composers, and he really came up with some new ways of thinking about musical form, musical harmony, musical melody. And along with Dizzy and Charlie Parker, he is a major contributor to the language of modern jazz that even now extends to this day. So I know you have some great listening, some good discussions this week, and we'll see you next week.